We've gone through the arguments for the existence of God, and because we've done that, there are now no longer any atheists. So, thanks for listening to the podcast, and I think we're done here. Well, unfortunately, it's not going to be that simple. We still have a few problems, as we've mentioned. These arguments are not new. They have been precisely stated since the time of the ancient Greeks, but they've been around even longer than that. And given that amount of time, critics of the Bible and critics of the existence of God in general have come up with a few responses to these arguments, as you can imagine. So in our next few episodes, we're going to be going over to common criticisms to the arguments for the existence of God. Welcome to the Gospel Call podcast, brought to you by the Purcellville Church of Christ. As we go into the responses to the arguments for the existence of God, we will spend one episode per response. Most of this time is going to be spent on the moral argument, because the moral argument for the existence of God also happens to be the one with the most criticism. It is also the only argument that has a logically valid, not logically sound, but logically valid argument against it. It doesn't work once you put a little bit of light on it. That's the problem of evil, which we are not going to be going over quite yet. We are going to be dealing with the Euthyphro dilemma, which is what we'll be talking about today, the problem of evil, both of which deal with the moral argument. And then we'll also talk about why Darwinistic evolution is not a proper response to the teleological argument for the existence of God. You might notice that we're not going to be devoting an episode to common responses to the cosmological argument, and that's because there really aren't a lot of them. I'm not saying that nobody has any sort of argument against it, but there's not a whole lot of common ones that you're going to hear. And most of the ones you can hear, you can usually parse out for yourself the logical inconsistencies. Normally you're going to hear something along the lines of, well, if everything requires something to create it, then who created God? We went over that when we were talking about the cosmological argument and talking about how God is a non-contingent being, and although we can't understand how he doesn't require anything to create him, that doesn't mean it's not true. He doesn't follow the laws of nature, he creates the laws of nature. So with the moral argument problems, and the Euthyphro dilemma in particular, we want to see how this dilemma potentially breaks the moral argument and what the problem with the dilemma is. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma because it was first brought up by Plato in a work called Euthyphro. For our purposes, a dilemma is any statement that gives two options, neither of which can be true. The dilemma that Plato presented in that work, Euthyphro, dealing with the moral argument, and if you don't remember, the moral argument states that if there is objective morality, then there must be an objective moral originator. The Euthyphro dilemma states that one of two things must be true if morality comes from an objective moral originator, in other words, God. It must mean that either A, morality is above God, or B, morality is below God. Now, like we said, a dilemma is going to present two possible options, neither of which can be true. So why would this be a problem if morality is either above or below God? And what we mean by that, by the way, is that it is something that God has control over, or it's something that God has no control over, but indeed it has control over God. So if it is above God, what the dilemma would say is that that means there must be some higher power than even God, because God is even subject to this law of morality. So where did that come from? If it is below God, then it means that morality is simply created by God at his whim, and that ultimately, although it means something a little bit more than just whatever we happen to decide is moral, but It would just mean that whatever God happened to decide was moral is moral. So, if tomorrow God decided that it's now moral to kill millions of people, then it would be. And that would be a terrible world to live in as well. And so that's our Euthyphro dilemma. God is either more powerful than morality, and he can create morality, or God is less powerful than morality, and morality has control over him. And then how can you have something more powerful than God? So that's our dilemma. We mentioned that dilemma is any time you have two possible options, and neither one of them can be true. As you can imagine, since I am a believer in the moral argument for the existence of God, I don't buy the Euthyphro dilemma. And here's why. The dilemma is a false dilemma. It gives only two options when more could be possible. So, if we're saying that morality might not be above God, and morality might not be below God, where could morality be? Well, let's take it away from a concept as intangible as morality and take it to something physical. Let's say your hand. Is your hand currently above you or below you? Did you detach your hand and throw it up into the air, or did you detach your hand and start standing on it? Well, unless it happens to be the case that you are an amputee, no offense intended, you probably can't answer honestly either one, because the two options that have been given have left out the third possibility, which is that your hand is part of you. Your hand cannot be above you. You know, we might say if we raise our hands that our hands are above us, but that's not technically true, is it? Our hands are still very much a part of us, and to say that the hand is above or below the body is to assume that it is something separate entirely. Well, it's something similar with morality. When we say that morality is either above or below God, we assume that morality cannot be on the same playing field as God, or, more precisely stated, morality is God. I know we said we weren't going to mention Bible verses too much in these first episodes, because if you don't believe in a God, then what's the point of going to the Bible? However, I would like to point out that the Bible does support this idea that morality is from God in a manner that it is part of him. It flows from God. Romans chapter 3 and verse 23 says, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." According to the book of Romans, sin is described as falling short to God's own glory. So, when we talk about the standard of morality, the standard that we really are applying is the standard that God sets himself. If you are to live without sin, then you are to live godly. And that's the most godlike possible manner that somebody could live. Of course, we know in practice nobody can actually live like that, but that's a discussion for another time. Morality is not below God, that he can randomly choose on a whim what is going to be moral. You have no fear that God is going to decide tomorrow that murder is okay, theft is okay, adultery is okay. It's not going to happen, because God uses himself as the standard. That's a mark of a good leader, you know, that they will never ask somebody to do something that they themselves are unwilling to do. In that sense, God's a good leader. He uses himself as the example. Nobody on earth has the obligation to be more moral than God, and indeed, it's not possible, because just like morality is not below God, it's not above him either. God could not possibly be more ethical, more moral, because God is ethics. God is moral. He uses himself as the standard. which would be ideal for all of us. If you're a parent, the ideal thing you could do in raising your children is be the perfect example for them. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen with any of us. But we do have a perfect example of good and evil, right and wrong, and that's God. We don't have to worry about him suddenly declaring that evil is good and good is evil, because evil is repulsive to God, and he himself is not capable of doing evil. And that might be a little bit confusing, because God is omnipotent. That means he's all-powerful. And I'm saying that God can't do certain things? Well, even God is subject to logic, because logic is not a force, it's simply an observation. And looking at God, God cannot simultaneously be good, perfect, yet evil and corrupt, because that is logically impossible. God cannot simultaneously exist and not exist. There are certain things that God can't do, and once again, the Bible tells us that very same thing. The Bible says that God cannot lie, implying, of course, that he cannot commit any sin. And the reason for this, why is there some sort of force that makes God unable to sin? Well, the answer is there is no force at all. Sin is ungodliness, and God is righteousness. If you would be moral, act like God. If you would be immoral, act in a manner that God would not. Of course, we understand that there are a few things that God would be able to do that we cannot, such as receive worship or enact justice for all sin. But once again, that's a discussion for another time. God chooses himself as the standard. Morality is not something that is above God, nor is it something that's below him. In truth, the Euthyphro dilemma falls short in two places, because honestly, if it were the case that morality were just the mere whim of God that could change at any moment, that still wouldn't break the moral argument. It would just make the world an incredibly sad place. But luckily, that isn't the case. God uses himself as the standard, and we can be assured that morality is never going to change. It's not a mere whim. God's morality is always going to be himself. So, that's the Euthyphro dilemma. That's why it's not a true dilemma at all, but a false dilemma. Next week, we're going to get into the only valid argument, the conclusion of which is, therefore, there is no God. I want to point out that the word valid does not mean true or sound, and indeed, we are going to pick a lot of holes in it, but at least it can be precisely stated in syllogistic form. We'll get into that next week. We hope that this episode has been helpful in your understanding and growing closer to God. And if you have any questions at all, we encourage you to email us at thegospelcallpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. We might respond immediately to your email, and we also might feature the question on the podcast. But we always want to help. It is our number one concern that we help teach. So if you have any questions at all, please email me. For the Purcellville Church of Christ, I'm DJ Kessinger. Thank you so much for listening.